started. 4, 3, 2, 1.
Good afternoon. I'm Ken Burton, Police Chief of the City of Columbia Police Department, and I'm going to read you a prepared written statement, and then I'll give you an opportunity to answer some questions. On February 11th, 2010, officers with the Columbia Police Department SWAT team served a search warrant at 1501 Kinloch Court in Columbia. This case has stirred the emotions of many people for many different reasons. Before publicly sharing the findings of this internal investigation, I feel compelled to provide some context from a police officer's view. Many people believe that marijuana should be legalized, and I would imagine that some police officers might even agree with you. Right now, it is illegal to distribute marijuana and to possess it. Police officers are expected to enforce the laws whether they are popular or not. We are not here to stand in the way of any citizen from approaching his or her senators or representatives at the state or federal level. There are also many different opinions about what constitutes aggressive behavior on the part of an animal, in this case, 2 dogs. The officers in question were there that evening. The rest of us were not. They had to evaluate the dogs face to face and assess the behaviors they were exhibiting and determine what those behaviors might mean. Several people have referred to the SWAT officers as armored, and so they don't understand how an aggressive dog could possibly pose a threat. Even in full SWAT gear, there are many parts of an officer's body that would remain at risk to a biting animal. Also, having to divert their attention away from the matter at hand to deal with the animal creates a risk that simply cannot be minimized once entry is initiated. The entry itself and the bigger picture of this particular search warrant are things we must discuss as well. Many people have expressed concern that since the officers found a small amount of marijuana and drug paraphernalia, that the basis for establishing probable cause for this warrant was flawed. However, the probable cause affidavit states that we had information that the defendant had a large amount of high-grade marijuana in the home. This information was presented to a judge who concluded it was sufficient to establish probable cause to search the residence for evidence of drug trafficking. It's very important that I talk with you about the actual service of the warrant. I have already stated that even though it is clearly within the confines of the law, the long-time CPD practice of waiting for days after obtaining a warrant and then using dynamic entry to serve it is unacceptable. The day after this incident in February, I took immediate action to ensure that the practice of waiting on those warrants ceased. Since then, I have continued to review our practices. We must consider the presence of children and animals when evaluating the risks involved in the use of a dynamic entry. This is one of the areas where I have made adjustments. We want the citizens of Columbia to know that this investigation was initiated by our own department. We realize that while people have waited for the outcome of the investigation, they have questioned our policies and our practices. I want the people of this community to know that I will continually review our department's policies and practices so that they best serve our citizens and our officers alike. And so we as a department, I as the police chief, initiated this investigation to determine the following 2 things. 1, were the actions of the police officers involved within Columbia Police Department policy, and were they appropriate, based on all the information the officers had available to them at that time. These are the only criteria by which the actions of these officers can be evaluated fairly. And second, did any of our policies or practices put our officers, the defendant, or his family at unnecessary risk? Was this an example of what we call best practices? Did we as a department do anything wrong in preparing for and choosing to serve this warrant? Should we do things differently in the future? I have 2 very different answers to those 2 very different issues. To answer question 1, were the actions of the officers on scene appropriate based on policy, law, and what they knew at the time? The answer is yes. Based on the facts in this investigation, I have concluded that the actions of the officers were within Columbia Police Department policy and state law regarding the use of force against the animals. The dog, described as a pit bull, exhibited aggressive behavior toward the officers 3 times during the very short time it took them to enter the residence and gain control. We'll discuss this in more detail when I cover the investigative findings for you. To answer question 2, should we do things differently in the future so this doesn't happen again? Yes. In your packet, there are 3 items, and there'll be packets made available to you at the conclusion of the press conference. In your packet, there will be 3 items in addition to a copy of these comments. One is a news release which includes the summary of the investigation and the findings. One is a departmental directive outlining the changes I have made. And one is a summary of the video that we took to record the service of the search warrant. I want to speak briefly about these items and then take questions. We want to assure the citizens who have heard misinformation that some of what they heard about this incident is simply not true. Neither dog was confined. Neither dog was shot in front of or near the people in the house. This happened at 8:30 p.m. in the evening, not in the middle of the night. Officers did not break in. The door was actually unlocked and no force was used on the door. And the search warrant was not issued for a misdemeanor amount of marijuana. However, one of the rumors was correct. It was the truth. And I'm going to tell you about it. A Columbia resident, a neighbor of the defendant, called the police department to ask what was going on. Why were shots fired in the neighborhood? And that person was not answered honestly. Why? And what have we done about that? When the neighbor called to ask about what was happening, the call was given to a young officer who had no knowledge about the search warrant. We're still finalizing the separate investigation into this, but he definitely told the caller bad information. He said something to the effect of this being a training exercise or drill, and that was simply untrue. As I said, that is being handled as a separate investigation itself, and it is being dealt with through our disciplinary process. It is never okay to tell law-abiding citizen bad information. So let me discuss the investigative findings with you. You will find a summary in your packets, a summary of the video that we took, and that most, if not all of you have seen, is included in your packets. The investigation began in February. The officers knew a child was present. They did not know dogs were present. The officers' decisions were based on the safety priorities they are taught to adhere to. Both dogs presented either a threat to the officers or a substantial tactical obstacle initially. The first dog retreated and then no longer posed a threat or tactical obstacle. The other dog did not retreat and continued to pose a threat or substantial tactical obstacle. Please look at the summary of the investigative findings for more details, as well as the video summary. Finally, let me go over the changes we've made and what we have yet to do. From now on, Bureau commanders or the investigative commander will make the decision about whether or not a narcotic search warrant will be served dynamically, and the manner in which it will be served is their sole discretion. This means the captain will receive a briefing about the warrant, review all intelligence related to the warrant. This will include an assessment of all potential dangers to the suspects and officers and any innocent, uninvolved people. And the captain must clearly identify what the law enforcement purpose of serving that warrant is. When officers with our department have established probable cause to obtain a search warrant, they will keep the address under surveillance. If the surveillance is interrupted, they won't serve the warrant, or they may have to serve it in a different manner. In other words, non-dynamically. Surveillance must include all available information, to include the presence of children and animals. Policy has been changed to state that narcotic search warrants must be served within 8 hours of receiving the warrant. If 8 hours pass, the service of the warrant must be approved and reevaluated through the deputy chief or his designee. Dynamic entry into a residence will be restricted. Dynamic entry is a very intrusive way to serve a search warrant, and less intrusive ways must be considered first. Our policy regarding the use of paid informants to establish any element of probable cause to search a private residence is being reviewed. The investigative commander will be taking a more active role and will routinely audit every informant in those transactions. Officers will identify and obtain arrest warrants to be served in conjunction with search warrants whenever possible. Helmet cameras are being purchased for every member of the SWAT team's entry team, and it will be required that they be in operation if they're on a warrant. To summarize, the Columbia Police Department has a very lengthy and structured SWAT manual outlining search warrant service along with other operational guidelines, their mission and philosophy, as well as technical components such as equipment and training. What I know as the chief is that while our SWAT members are well trained and are held to strict guidelines, we have utilized SWAT routinely in circumstances and situations where we should not. We have utilized dynamic entries in circumstances and situations where we should not. This practice has now changed. The change is for the benefit of our citizens and of our officers. In addition, narcotic units detectives work very diligently and thoroughly on their investigations. What happened in this incident shows very clearly that there was not the necessary coordination between divisions. We had a good investigation that culminated in the detectives receiving a search warrant. Then the timing of the search warrant fell in the hands of another group of officers. That is not acceptable. We did not coordinate this properly as a department, and that will not happen again. Sometimes a crisis provides the impetus and the opportunity to change. The best you can do is seize those opportunities. I'll now take your questions.